about basic principles for both Android and iOS when you deal with populating tables or populating lists of things. That you see, for example, the list of emails or a list of groceries or any list that is interactive in these platforms. So basically, you have list view or table view, we'll call her view for short. This character, this object, right? She can actually draw lists to be displayed in a mobile device, and her lists have physics in them, so if you swipe them they bounce, or if you swipe them really hard then they slow down as they get to the bottom. They have momentum and all that stuff. They have physics, and she actually knows how to draw them and so that they look cool and agree with the platform that you're working in. Now, for example, one of the lists can be this list of the weather, right? So here's the weather in different cities with a little image and some detail, right? And you can swipe up and down and so on and so forth. But it wasn't always like this. It didn't start like this. There's a lot of object interactions so that this object view can draw these things. So it all started like this. The user, right, wants to display a list, but this component, the list view or the table view, she wants to draw a list. She can draw very good lists, she's very good at it, but didn't know what to put in each cell or each row for the list, right? This component can draw lists, but doesn't know what data goes in the lists or how the cells are, each of the rows or each of the cells is laid out. She just knows if you give her a cell, she knows how to draw a list. She didn't even know how many cells to draw. Now we have on the other side a guy called Data, and has a lot of weather data to show, is ready to show it, but doesn't know how to draw a list or to display it. Now a human puts the data here, right? And for her, no human tells her how to draw a list. They only tell her what each cell looks like and what information goes in it, but no human tells her how to draw the list and how to create the physics. All right, so we have this little problem, and this problem is exacerbated by the fact that she, list view or view, doesn't speak data source or data, and data doesn't speak list view. So they can't communicate. Well, to the rescue comes a guy that speaks both languages, right? Some call him adapter, and can also go by data source, one word, right? Depending. In Android, we call this guy adapter. In iOS, we call this guy data source. Oh, that's great. Well, it can get data to draw the list. So list view requests data from data source. And data source says, sure, ask me anything that you want to know about your list, that you need to draw your list. For example, how many cells there should be and what should go in each cell. So then the table view or list view starts asking questions. Okay, so how many cells should the list draw, the view draw? And then the guy in the middle, data source or adapter, doesn't know, but he can ask the data source, the source of the data. So it asks data, how many data points do you have to display? And then from the model, from data, you get the answer for that. For example, in this case, there's 5 cities. So then our adapter or data source tells the view that there's going to be 5 cells. And then the view somehow allots space for 5 cells and asks, okay, and now it knows that it has to ask for the information for 5 cells. So it starts asking what goes on cell number 0, which is the first cell. Again, our adapter data source doesn't know, so it has to ask the actual data. And it asks what information goes in that cell that the view just requested, number 0. And then the data responds, well, Berlin, 0 degrees, and the word snowing. Now it is on the data source or the adapter to actually design the cell and the look of it. So for example, it can say to the view that the cell number 0 will have an image of snow, the title Berlin, and 0 degrees Celsius with the word snowing. So some of this comes from the data, right? This Berlin, the snowing, the 0 Celsius. But then the data source also did some tricks, to look at these words and actually select the correct picture, right? So the data source or adapter designs what goes in the cell. It gives the list view or the table view an actual cell laid out and everything. So then the cell will put it, and the view will put it on the list view or table view. Now it asks for the second cell, right? Cell number 1. And the same dialog ensues. The middleman here, the adapter data source, asks the actual data, what information should go there. The data actually, or the database or whatever, responds with Bangalore 23 degrees Celsius and thunderstorms, and the word thunderstorms. So then the adapter or data source will lay out a cell with that information and will pass it to the view, which will actually assemble it in a list. Then it asks for the second cell, or for the third cell, right? And so on and so forth. After 5 times, the view has all the elements to draw the list, right? And look, now it created a table, and that table will look great. And you can swipe up and down, and you can do other stuff, and that table is actually embedded. There's like a little title here, but the table view knew how to create this. Now let's look at a little bit more in the object orientation model in an UML-ish format, how these classes look like or interact. For Android, and these are the credits, right? So for Android, we had data, which is the model, adapter, and list view. So these are the names that they receive in Android. Usually the data, or the model, just has methods to manipulate the data. The adapter has methods to interact with the data source, methods that are expected by what we call a list view, like returning the size of the list, returning a cell at a given position. And the list view has a member variable called adapter, right? So in your code, you will set the adapter of a list view to the adapter that you implemented, right, that interacts with the data that you have. In iOS, the credits go to, again, data model. Now, data source and table view. This is actually a table view data source, okay? But for generic, I'll call it data source. So, and it's very similar. This is very similar, the interaction. The data source has methods to interact with the actual source of the data, like data source, separate 2 words, and methods that are expected by the table view, like returning the size of the list and returning a cell at a given position. And the table view has a member variable called data source, right, which can be set to the class that you implemented here. Now there's one other bit. So we had our how to populate the data. Now, if you want to tap on any of the cells of the table or the list, something should happen. If you want to interact with it in any other way, like swipe it or long press it or something should happen, right? Now, for that to happen, the table view or the list view doesn't know what to do when you tap on a cell. It just knows that you've tapped on the cell, perhaps, right? So she outsources that to what's called a delegate or to a bunch of listeners. So the delegate, for example, will say, when you detect an interaction, I will be alert and act upon that on those interactions, right? So the delegate is always alert. Now this model is slightly differs a little bit between iOS and Android. So for Android, you have your list view that has a bunch of listeners, has member variables of type onScroll listener, on item click listener, on other listeners for different events of the table, right? So scrolling, clicking on an item, right? And all of these are its own interface. They have a lot of common elements, right? But all of these are its own interface. And then you can implement many listener classes depending on what you want to listen and set it to these member variables, right? So this is why you have several kinds of listeners each one prepared to listen a given event that can be attached to the list view. On iOS, on the other hand, the table view detects the table view will have what's called a table view delegate, usually one class. And this delegate has several kinds of functions. So when the table view, for example, detects a long press, it will call the delegate's long press function. When the table view detects a tap, it will call the delegate's tab function, and so on and so forth. And this is basically how table views, or list views, depending on which system you're using, work.